Welcome back to Tipton Bros. Today, we'll be reviewing the most innovative and out-of-the-box semi-automatic surplus rifles. As per usual, I'll try my best to diversify the list and provide you with choices you may not have considered. I will continue creating this type of content in the future, so let me know what you think down in the comments. Again, I am no expert and never claim to be. And before we begin, please excuse any errors I may make, as information is sparse and conflicting. Let's get into it. Starting out our list at number 5, we have selected the Meunier A6, the first semi-automatic rifle developed and approved by the French Army. Beginning in 1894, the French government would go out in search of a semi-automatic rifle to replace the newly adopted 1886-93 Lebel and its variants. Although the Lebel line of rifles was recently adopted, the French had the foresight to realize that semi-automatic combat rifles were the way of the future. The Meunier pattern of rifle would go through 6 iterations, beginning in 1898 and ending in 1910, when the final pattern of Meunier, the A6, would be tested and approved by French forces. The Meunier A6 was chambered in a proprietary 7x57mm cartridge, also known as 7mm Meunier. This round fired a roughly 139-grain projectile at approximately 2,950 feet per second. Although the French intended for the Meunier A6 to go into production starting to tool up in 1910 until 1913, the rifle would be eventually shelved as a global conflict loomed on the horizon. The French would elect to continue Lebel production, bolstering their armament leading into the Great War. The Lebel was a proven and reliable design that would ultimately be a safer bet. So, the Meunier A6 would sit out, being sidelined for nearly half of the First World War. Finally, in 1916, the French government felt confident enough to commission the production of 1,013 Meunier A6 rifles. Reports indicated that tight tolerances of the Meunier rifle were not well suited to trench warfare, and thus, what remained of the issued rifles were returned. The Meunier A6 used a long recoil action, like you would see on a show-shot. The barrel was free-floating, allowing for the action to cycle properly, with the barrel and bolt moving in unison the length of the cartridge, cycling the action. This alone would not be an issue, but when you introduce conditions such as mud and grit, it makes the rifle far more conducive to malfunctions. The fitting of the nose cap to the barrel was so exact that if any sediment were to find its way between the two, the rifle would seize up, especially if rust or grime was left to sit. The Meunier, while unsuccessful, was a step in the right direction and would later give way to the RSC Model 1917. With the adoption of the RSC, the Meunier rifle program was scrapped. While essentially this was the end of the Meunier A6, roughly 3 rifles were converted to carbines for use by the French Air Force, being equipped with 15-round magazines loaded via stripper clip. The tolerances for these carbines were also loosened substantially to help aid in reliability. Being produced in such low numbers, while simultaneously being used in brutal combat, only a minute fraction of the original examples remain. I could find no price range for the Meunier A6 rifle, as I would have to assume most are in private collections or museums. While the Meunier A6 was generally considered a lackluster rifle, its contributions to firearms development were substantial, paving the way for the RSC Model 1917, and later serving as an example to future designers. Now, on to our 4th pick. Coming in at number 4, the Armagera Model of 1939. This modern self-loader was designed by Francesco Nasterzio and Gino Ravelli, the son of Abiel Ravelli, who is best known for designing the Villar Perosa in 1914. The Armagera Model 1939 was intended to substitute the M38 Carcano bolt-action rifles. This adoption of a new rifle was envisioned to go hand in hand with the implementation of a new caliber, a 7.35 by 51mm, a step up in power from the previous 6.5 by 52mm, which the Italian army viewed as underpowered despite being rather potent. While transitioning to a modern self-loader on top of employing an updated cartridge may sound like an obvious choice, the strain to carry out the task would be far more arduous. The Armagera was tested against its peers in 1939, coming out of the trial victorious, besting the Breda Model 1935 and the aging, experimental Scotty Model X. Mechanically, the model of 1939 used a pivoting locking block and a short recoil action, being the most advanced and simplistic design available to the Kingdom of Italy. The Armagera also possessed a neat feature, using the front sling swivel as the charging handle, permitting the gun to be virtually snag-free. Whether that would be effective in combat or not is up for debate. Chambered in the newfangled 7.35 51mm and fed via 6-round M-block clips, the confidence of the Italians in their new innovative rifle was steadily mounting. But as they would come to find out, the cost of producing and fielding a brand new type of ammunition was far beyond what was allotted. With Italy unable to convert to the new 7.5 cartridge, they would begrudgingly turn back to the 6.5. Hurriedly redesigning the Armagera for the 6.5 by 52mm cartridge. A factory was raised in order to churn out this recently adopted self-loader, with an order of 10,000 rifles being placed. Unfortunately for the Italians, the Second World War reached their doorstep well in advance of what was expected. This sudden encroachment had a ripple effect, forcing the Rivelle Armagera company to suddenly switch gears. With a meager 100 Model 1939s completed, the factory would be retooled to produce Carcano-style rifles. While production was halted for the Armagera company, a small number of rifles were assembled from existing parts throughout the war, with an estimated 500 or fewer serving until 1945. A much smaller number survive today in private collections and museums around the world, with approximately 40 in existence. Despite never getting off the ground, the Armagera Model 1939 was a superb rifle with ergonomics in mind, being one of the top designs to leave the Kingdom of Italy. Taking our third spot on the list, the Mauser Selbstläufer model of 1916. Developed by Wilhelm and Paul Mauser, the model of 1916 was a further iteration of earlier designs, the two primary culprits being the Mauser Model 0608 and Model 10-13 self-loading rifles. The Selbstläufer Model 1916 took more than a decade to come to fruition, and when the dust began to settle, all that was left was an overcomplicated kludge of a rifle. The model of 1916 utilized a flapper-locked, recoil-operated system, wherein a cam plate would move under recoil to unlock the rifle, with additional help from two sizable flappers. This system exploited the ever-popular 7.92 by 57mm, commonly referred to as 8mm Mauser. This cartridge was the mainstay of German forces up through the Second World War. The Selbstläufer model of 1916 was issued with a 20 or 25 round magazine depending on which variant the soldier was issued, those variants being the full-length or infantry rifle and the carbine, which saw frequent use by aircrews. The full-length variant boasted a handguard that stretched the length of the rifle, as you might expect, but the carbine, on the other hand, had a drastically shortened stock with the addition of what I would describe as a palm swell on the front side of the magazine. Another interesting mechanical feature, aside from the action, is the release mechanism for the magazine. That being the trigger guard, which swings down at a 25-degree angle, acting as a plunger, which in turn releases the magazine. These rifles were designed in 1915 and ultimately fielded in 1916, seeing hard use. The reliability of the model 1916 Selbstläufer was dubious at best, having a myriad of mechanical issues. Even improper positioning of the rifle when shooting would induce malfunctions. The finicky system of the Selbstläufer was only exacerbated by the conditions of the trench warfare, essentially leaving the rifle inoperable. While the flaws were still present in the carbine variant, the conditions around it were far more favorable. Being out of the muddy trenches and into the air allowed it to function as best it could, which was still unsatisfactory. The Selbstläufer Model 1916 would soon be phased out by the German Empire as they would quickly venture to find a better alternative. With combined production of all variants reaching an estimated 600 or so, these firearms are extremely scarce today, with a large majority being lost or destroyed in combat. As with most, if not all firearms on this list, I will not be able to provide an estimated cost, with a large majority of examples being in private collections or museums. The model of 1916 Selbstläufer is by far one of the most mechanically fascinating mechanisms on the list, and arguably of the 20th century, effortlessly topping the list as the strangest rifle brought to life from the minds of Wilhelm and Paul Mauser. This firearm will not soon be forgotten. Holding our second position on the list, the General Liu Rifle. This rifle was named after its designer, General Liu, by default, as a proper designation for the rifle was never given. The General Liu rifle is the closest China would come to a domestically produced, self-loading rifle in the lead-up to the Second World War. The Liu rifle used a similar cycling mechanism to the Danish Bang rifle. A cap at the muzzle would trap gas as a round left the barrel and redirect it to a cam that would then cycle the action. While not a perfect system that suffered from gas fouling in the nose cone, it was a moderately better option than other self-loading actions of the period. At the time of its design by General Liu in 1914, he was the superintendent of the Hanyang Arsenal, located in the Hubei province of China. Being the overseer for one of the largest firearms manufacturers in China, it seemed as though General Liu and his rifle were bound for success. But as we now know, this would soon change. In the infancy of 1914, Liu would reach an agreement with the Pratt & Whitney Tool Company out of Hartford, Connecticut, in hopes they could produce machinery for the Hanyang Arsenal. Roughly a dozen rifles were produced by Pratt & Whitney under close watch of Liu, his family, and several workers from the Hanyang Arsenal. A small handful of these rifles were brought back to the Chinese mainland and tested, being met with overall positive reviews. Finally, in 1919, the machinery was shipped to China, but in an unfortunate twist of events, General Liu would suffer a debilitating stroke and die soon after. With Liu now gone, the program for his rifle began to crumble. The machinery would lay dormant in China for nearly 2 years, until it would ironically be delivered to the Hanyang Arsenal. Tooling would not produce the Liu rifle, however. It would be repurposed to first produce the Hanyang 88 rifle, and later the Type 24 Chiang Kai-shek rifle. While an unfortunate ending for General Liu and his rifle, his machinery would still be put to good use, although not serving its original purpose. General Liu and his design were well before their time, and who knows what the outcome or consequences may have been if Liu was able to have his rifle adopted. We will never know. It is estimated that 30 General Liu rifles were ever produced, all by Pratt & Whitney, with only 5 known examples surviving today. This may be one of the biggest what-ifs in firearms history, as the implications of adopting a self-loading rifle so early could have been groundbreaking. Now, for our honorable mention. As our honorable mention, the AG-42B Jungmann. The original variation, being the AG-42, was invented by Erik Eklund of the Jungmann's Verkstäder company out of Malmö, Sweden in 1941. The AG-42 would be Sweden's first common-issue self-loading rifle. Having a bit less than 1 year of development, the AG-42 would be swiftly adopted and put into production the following year by the Carl Gustaf's rifle factory, with a solid 30,000 rifles being produced. While this may sound like a large batch of rifles, it pales in comparison to the Swedish Model 1896 Mauser and its variants, with 750,000 or so being completed, making the AG-42 and the AG-42B moderately rare in contrast. The Jungmann was chambered in the comfortable 6.5 by 55mm cartridge, fed via 10-round box magazine. The Jungmann also employed a direct gas impingement system, wherein gas would directly impact the bolt carrier after firing. The action was secured using a tilting breech block, which was commonplace for the period. After roughly 8 years of service, several issues were raised about the rifles, a few chief complaints being the rusting of gas tubes, as well as an erratic ejection of spent cases, among many others. These issues were quickly addressed, as the current inventory of rifles were updated with stainless steel gas tubes, a modernized elevation knob, a rubber case deflector, and 2 knurled knobs on the action cover. The updated rifles would also be outfitted with new magazines and cleaning rods. The enhanced Jungmann would be dubbed the AG-42B. This variant is now what is most common within the United States. Around 1953, the manufacturer license for the AG-42B was sold to Egypt, who would go on to produce the Hakim, rechambering the rifle in 8mm Mauser. Egypt not only purchased the right to produce the rifle, but the machinery to do so as well. Thus, most, if not all, Hakim rifles were produced on the same tooling as the AG-42B. As some of you may know, a number of Hakim rifles were modified into carbines and rechambered in the 7.62 by 39mm cartridge. These are known as Rashid carbines. While the Jungmann never truly saw combat, they were issued to Norwegian troops that I would liken to the French gendarmerie towards the end of the Second World War, being present during the German surrender in 1945. Here in the US today, a decent example of an AG-42B will draw upwards of $1,400, but I do consider that to be a modest estimate. While I would not consider a Jungmann rare, they are certainly not commonplace on the surplus market and do fetch a premium if you are able to track one down. I one day hope to own an AG-42B for myself. They are quality built and have gone unappreciated until recently. Hopefully I will be able to find one before they rise any further in price. Now, on to our top spot. Holding our top spot, the Madsen Rasmussen, model of 1896. The Madsen Rasmussen, model of 1896, holds the distinction of being the first semi-automatic rifle formally adopted by a military. The rumor floats around that the 1907 Mondragon was the first self-loading rifle to be adopted, but in fact, the model of 1896 predates the adoption of the Mondragon by nearly a decade. The model 1896 is a refined edition of the 1888 Madsen Rasmussen, which was rejected by the Danish during trials. To explain the updates to the new pattern, I must first describe the action. The Madsen Rasmussen rifles were short recoil operated, using a falling breech block, not unlike that of a Martini Henry. The breech block would tilt vertically during recoil, tilting down to allow the feeding of an unfired cartridge, remaining in a neutral position when firing, and locking the breech and tilting up when a spent casing is to be ejected. The initial pattern of 1888 was also fed via top-loading, gravity-fed, fixed clip, being charged with a drop lever situated under the rifle, again, not unlike the Martini Henry. While this may sound complex, I promise it is necessary to understand the changes made to create the pattern of 1896. As previously stated, Madsen and Rasmussen lost out in the 1887 Danish rifle trials and would immediately get to work. They would first update the outdated charging lever, replacing it with a rotary handle affixed to the right side of the receiver. Secondly, they would address the fixed open-top clip, swapping with a more reliable enclosed removable box magazine, although it would still be gravity-fed and would not utilize a follower or spring. Lastly, and perhaps most important, the mechanism was refined for more reliable function. This included all aspects of the magazine and action. With this substantially improved rifle, the Madsen Rasmussen would again be considered by the Danish military, who deemed it consistent enough for use in a limited capacity. A grand total of 60 Madsen Rasmussen model of 1896 rifles were purchased and issued for use by the Danish Navy, intended to be used in the defense of coastal fortifications. In 1898, a company which we have previously discussed, Dansk Rifle Syndicate, was formed, allowing for the company to expand internationally. Madsen and Rasmussen would soon sell their patent rights in exchange for royalties. The man who would take over is one I am now familiar with, Jens Schalbo, who in 1899 held the title company manager. Therefore, you may sometimes hear the Madsen rifle denoted as a Schalbo rifle. As you may have already concluded, This platform would go on to help forge the Madsen light machine gun. When I research these videos, I always find it interesting how many firearms designers cross paths with one another. Yet, these events are seldom mentioned. As with this video, I was unaware Jens Chalbo purchased the patent rights from Madsen and Rasmussen in 1899, then took over as company manager of the Recoil Rifle Syndicate. It's always neat to see how history works itself together. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Again, if you disagree with anything I have said, or have a question, please feel free to drop it down in the comments. I am no expert and never claim to be. A like is greatly appreciated, and we hope to see you next time on Tipton Bros.